Welcome back to GMTV. Well, 31 years ago this month, Harold Wilson stunned the political world by announcing his resignation as Prime Minister. It triggered a wave of speculation about his motives, which continues to this day. But it also set in motion a leadership contest in which many of the senior figures in Wilson's cabinet stood. The eventual victor was James Callaghan, who was Prime Minister for just 3 years before losing the 1979 election to Margaret Thatcher. Joining me now to reflect on those events and contemporary echoes, perhaps, are three senior members of the Wilson and Callaghan governments, and all of whom played a major role in one way or another in the politics of the Labour Party in the decade that followed. Tony Benn joined the cabinet in 1966 and served under both Wilson and Callaghan. He stood in the leadership contest of 1976 and went on, of course, to become a leading figure, the leading figure on the left of the Labour Party. Roy Hattersley held ministerial office under Wilson and joined the cabinet in 1976 when Jim Callaghan took over. A candidate for the leadership in 1983, he served with Neil Kinnock as the party's deputy leader for 9 years. And David Owen, who served as a junior minister under Wilson and Callaghan before becoming Foreign Secretary in 1977 after the death of Tony Crosland. He went on to co-found and then lead the Social Democratic Party in the 1980s. Thank you all very much for coming along. I think probably the first time you've been in a studio together for quite some time. But anyway, thank you all very much. Could I begin, Tony Benn? You were in the cabinet when Harold Wilson announced he was going as Prime Minister. There had been no hype in the press in advance, no endless speculation. It must have been the most extraordinary political moment to hear those words from.
Not so. He told me ages before he was going to resign when he was 60, and he resigned 2 weeks later.
So you really were expecting it?
And also, my driver said to me, the Prime Minister's going to resign, and I said, why? And he said, because up to now, ex-Prime Ministers don't get motor cars. Leaders of the opposition and Prime Ministers do, and they changed the rules so ex-Prime Ministers get cars. And I said that to him at Harold's farewell dinner, and Marcia said, you are a wicked man. So, I mean, I didn't know it was going to be that day, but I did know he was going to go.
But nonetheless, I mean, maybe you were all privileged enough to have sort of inside information, but outside, it was a complete shock, Roy.
A total shock to me. I was number 2 in the Foreign Office, and I'd gone to Bulgaria that day. The previous day, Jim Callaghan had sent for me and said, if I ever got in the cabinet, what job would I like to do? It never struck me there was going to be a new Prime Minister. I thought Jim was going to speak on my behalf to Harold Wilson. And off I went to Bulgaria, landed at the airport, playing the Bulgarian national anthem, which goes on for a very long time, and me holding a great sheaf of flowers. And our ambassador, a man called Eddie Bolland, his name's engraved on my mind, said out of the corner of his mouth, the Prime Minister's resigned. And I said out of the corner of my mouth, perhaps I didn't read the notes properly. Is he the big noise here, or is that the president of the party? And he said, not their Prime Minister, our Prime Minister. So it came with an absolute and total shock to me.
Was it a shock to you?
Harold Wilson decided to tell 2 people that he was going to resign, and he told, I think, Jim Callaghan personally in December, and he got Harold Lever to tell Roy Jenkins. And Roy Jenkins came to lunch with me in the turn of the year, and he swore me to secrecy, and he said there is going to be an election. I then tried to gear Roy up to do all the necessary things in order to win it, like going around the tea room and talking to everybody and being friendly, but he didn't do it. But then, so although the actual day came as a complete surprise, but I wasn't there in the cabinet when it was announced.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we're going through a period now where people are wondering about whether Tony Blair has stayed on too long and all the rest of it. Harold Wilson, who has been widely criticised in different ways by all of you, pulled off the prime ministerial resignation with unusual dignity, didn't he?
Absolutely. He came to us and he said, were you in the cabinet then?
No, I wasn't.
No. Well, he came into the cabinet and he said, I've got an announcement to make. And he then read a list of all the cabinet meetings he'd attended, all the parliamentary answers. You know what Harold was like. I mean, his legacy was statistical, being a member of the... And then he said, I'm going to leave because I've got to see the Queen. I'm going to announce I'm going to resign. And when he left, there was a great sense of shock. And I think Shirley said we must move a motion of thanks, or George, I can't remember what it was. And so that was it. And then he went off. And that afternoon, I've never forgotten, I went through the division lobby, and normally a Prime Minister is surrounded by a mass of people saying, what a good speech, Prime Minister. Harold was almost alone.
Roy, do you think there were any complicated reasons for the resignation? There's been kind of sinister speculation about it, you know, whether it was involving kind of spies and conspiracies.
No, I don't.
None of that
I
applies.
share Tony's view entirely. Not that I was in any way a confidant of Harold's, but other people, David tells us about Roy Jenkins, George Thomas, who became Speaker, who was very close to Harold, said afterwards he'd always made clear he was going to leave on his 60th birthday, and would in fact have left rather earlier, but I think there was a dock strike, and he felt he had to postpone it for 2 or 3 weeks. I'm sure he meant to leave on his 60th birthday. Yes. I think his wife wanted him to leave, and I think it was a purely straightforward decision.
Do you think, David, I mean, you've done a great deal of study recently about illness and prime ministers. Do you think Wilson sensed then that his famous memory and his statistical memory, as Tony was suggesting, was extraordinary, was starting to fade, and therefore with great dignity he just said, I'm going?
I think that's true. He had something wrong with his heart in probably 1973 when he was in opposition. He was determined to beat Ted Heath and get back into number 10. And I think he told Mary he wasn't going to stay long. And then I think that having a photographic memory, it's like a sort of watchmaker, you know, if that starts to go wrong or your eyesight goes wrong in the case of a watchmaker, I think it did upset him. It was not serious. I mean, he was still, in my view, at that stage, in full possession of all his faculties. But I think that tipped him into resignation. Apart from his dissolution honours list, which was not a very fine episode, he went with great dignity.
And highly unusual, isn't it? Because power is addictive, isn't it? We're seeing at the moment with Tony Blair his desire to stay on apparently to the very last possible moment in July or whenever. And Wilson appeared addicted to power, to outsiders, and yet he got off the drug.
I think Wilson is the only Prime Minister this century who had gone in an entirely voluntary way. And I don't think there were very many in the 19th century, but certainly this century, some of them have appeared to volunteer their resignations, but they were always pushed quietly. They were always told that if they didn't go quietly, then they'd go in a very noisy fashion. I think Harold is the only one who's gone really voluntarily.
Yes.
No, I wonder whether he did have some anxieties about the economy, because after he left, there was the cuts in public spending in July and then the IMF. He may have sensed that, but the theory is that it was scandal or I don't believe, because he took on a job soon after, and he was chairman of the committee looking at the role of the City of London, and he wouldn't have taken on a new job. It wasn't a very well-paid job, but he undertook to look at it. So I think it was absolutely genuine, and I agree with Roy. He decided to go, he went with dignity, he went quickly. There was an election, perfectly cordial election campaign, and Jim won.
Holding the referendum and winning it was, I think, the threshold for him.
The 75 common market.
He had taken a hell of a lot of flack all through the early 70s, some of which I contributed to. And we said that he turned his back on Europe, he absolutely outrageous. He had some very tough, aggressive editorials in the Times. And Harold Lever, again, who I'd resigned with on this issue of Europe, always said to me, you watch it. Harold is determined to be seen again as a good European, and he means this referendum is not for him just a sort of gesture. He intends to win it, and he did. He won it. It was he and Callaghan who won it. It wasn't the campaign saying yes. It was the fact he switched the votes inside the Labour Party.
Before we look ahead to what followed from his resignation, I mean, Wilson, on the whole, I think you would agree, has had a pretty sort of bad press since his resignation as a Prime Minister. Maybe some revisionism is starting to happen. But one thing he did do, given what we all know followed, is he did keep all three of you, so to speak, in the same party. In retrospect, was that a underestimated talent as a leader?
Well, first of all, I think his reputation has improved with the years. I think, looking back, he looks far better than many of us thought of him at the time. That's not always the case with Prime Ministers, but I think the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, looks better now than he did 30 years ago. And I regard the achievement of keeping the party together as absolutely crucial. The party is the great engine for his beliefs and my beliefs and Tony's belief, and to a certain degree, David Owen's. And that he was able to do that in this extremely, hit word, vociferous party, which I've discovered by looking it up meant likely to fall apart. He was able to do this with the party is a very, very great achievement. It's an achievement which is now underrated, but I regard it as a very, very great accomplishment.
My guess is that you would have preferred him to have sort of taken on the side of the party that you were opposed to, or do you pay tribute to his unifying skills?
At the time, I would have wanted him to come down on our side, yes, and I was very critical of him for not doing so. But that doesn't mean that I can't see the benefits of a leader keeping a party together. And indeed, you can argue it's a very high priority. I don't think it's the highest priority, but everybody can argue about that. But I think that Wilson was very adept at it. But it led him into the charge of trickiness and deviousness and things like that, which, you know, is a price you pay, if you like, for riding all these different horses in the ring.
It wasn't just keeping us together, but allowing and encouraging collective discussion. I mean, the Cabinet was the most interesting committee I ever sat on. There are people that even now, Giant, Gerald Gardner, Roy Jenkins, Dick Crossman, Barbara Castle, a formidable group. And I looked it up in my diary. In January 1968, we had 8 full-day meetings of the Cabinet in a single month.
See, Tony Blair would say that's 8 too many.
Well,
or
of
at
course
least
he would,
7
because
too
the
many.
Cabinet meets for 20 minutes now for him to tell ministers what he's decided. And that was important. But, you see, old Ian McCarthy used to say, a bird can't fly only on its right wing. And I think that... and Jim was just the same. Jim kept people together. And after all, if you're not committed to this, if you didn't participate in the decision, you're not committed to it. So that held the government together. Nowadays, I don't think any Cabinet Minister can feel committed to something that he was told had been decided by the Prime Minister privately somewhere else.
And because of this, we did avoid what I think is the most undesirable feature of the present government, which is all the backbiting, Cabinet Ministers talking off the record to parliamentary journalists to get unpleasant things about their colleagues in print, all the manoeuvring, am I supporting Gordon, is Gordon going to get it? You know, throughout all these years, when there were a number of people who I suspect thought of themselves as candidates for the next leadership, Tony was certainly one, Dennis Healey was the prime candidate, there was no movement saying we're backing Healey, we're undermining Wilson or Callaghan for Benn. Because we discussed policy, we managed to avoid backbiting about individuals, and I think that's a very important political achievement.
But was it quite... I mean, let's now move on to the leadership contest that followed. I mean, what's interesting, again, looking at it through a contemporary prism, is at the moment, it appears anyway, as if the Labour Party will go into a leadership election this summer with one sort of candidate that looks overwhelmingly as if he's going to win, Brown. In the post-Wilson leadership, there were quite a few cabinet ministers representing different strands of the party, including you, Tony, who went for it. A completely different set of circumstances.
Well, in those days, I looked it up to find out you just got nominated and seconded. You didn't need 44 nominations. That's by the by. But I made a speech setting out. I published a pamphlet called New Course for Labour. And I made a speech, and somebody, when Jim became leader, somebody in the House of Commons asked whether he agreed with the speech made by me. And Jim said if I hadn't been a candidate myself, I might have voted for him. And there was a lot of good nature about it. And I think Jim came out of it very, very well. And there was no bitterness in that campaign at all. There were different candidates, and then a second option, I forget. Who was knocked out the first time round? I think Crossland was knocked out.
He came, he got surprisingly few votes. He didn't get your vote, did he?
Get my vote,
to his fury, I think.
Well, with limited fury.
Yeah, I remember that story.
David, in that election, just right, did you vote for Jim Callaghan? I know you...
No, I voted for Roy Jenkins first, to some extent out of loyalty. I voted for Dennis Healey second out of affection and wish that he would be the Prime Minister. And then I voted somewhat reluctantly for Jim Callaghan. So, I mean, I was never a great Callaghanite, but I stand to be one of his great supporters as Prime Minister. I think he emerged
as a great Owenite.
Well, it helped, of course, that people promoted me. But before I went into the Cabinet, I thought and Tony won't agree with this, but I thought the speech he made in 1976 was the dawn of economic realism in our country. And I believe
monetarism, you mean?
Yes,
the one about
monetarism. I defend monetarism. I believe it was necessary. I think that discipline, and I think it was extremely important that it started under Callaghan and under Dennis Healey, and it was not a Thatcherite invention.
No, she followed on.
She followed on, and
then
I think that
Blair's
now it's all kept
further,
ever
yes.
since. And I believe that we were in a habit of spending ourselves out of any competitive position. So.
But were we not at this point? I mean, you've all spoken very generously about the spirit in which that leadership contest took place, and there's no question from my very limited memory of it, there wasn't the sort of odd backbiting you get now at the top of the Labour Party. But that leadership contest, did it not, Tony, revealed the sort of divisions that were ideologically going to cause all the problems in the years that were to follow. In other words, by then, Roy Jenkins and David Owen were moving in a very different ideological difference to you.
Oh, no, I agree. I mean, when the right left the party in 81, 10% of the Labour MPs left the party and joined their own party. That was very, very damaging, and you could argue that split was beginning to be evident in 76. But that's history now. You look back on it all.
Yeah,
I don't think it was. I mean, the great thing that happened immediately after 76 was the IMF crisis. And the Cabinet, discussing the IMF crisis, not only met, how many times did we meet, Tony? 8 times?
I think
eight times.
Again, Tony Blair would say 8 times too many.
We met day after day, and there were 3 distinct points of view. There was the Chancellor's point of view, there was a point of view led principally by Tony and by Peter Shaw, and there was the Crossland point of view, which attracted about 3 of us. And we argue these different points of view, and in very many ways they were fundamentally different. But at the end of the day, we came to an agreed conclusion, and we stuck to it, and the Cabinet went on unified and united for the next 3 years.
And Jim, in fairness, that I've never forgotten, when he was asked, he said, when people criticised, he said, well, your point was put in the Cabinet, but we decided to do this. So he legitimised the debate after it had taken place. I thought that was a really generous...
election. That's the real thing. I mean, it was an election. What was the electorate? 350 people? The Parliamentary Labour.
The Labour MPs only had the vote.
No, but now it's a real election. I mean, I read in the newspapers that candidates for the deputy leadership of the Labour Party are hiring public relations agencies. Now, that's a rather different election to the one in which Tony took part and I took part some years later.
But I'd like to take you to a point where I think the Callaghan government could have won the election, and that was December 78, when there was going to be a vote with the Tribune Group voting against the settlement, the large settlement in the Ford in car industry. And Roy, that day, was due to head a debate, and a small group of us just happened to be meeting with Jim, and we formed ourselves into a group that had to try to decide whether to make a vote of confidence of that. If that had been made a vote of confidence, as Roy argued for, I believe it would probably have been won, but even if it hadn't been won, we'd have held a general election. It would have gone over December, January, and I'm absolutely confident we would have won that election.
And we would have won in the autumn of
78. Jim wrote to all of us, remember, in the summer of 76, said, 78, what do you think? And I wrote to him, and I said, I remember at the time, I said, I think we may lose control of the situation over the winter. And he went to the TUCs, remember, and they expected him to announce the election, and then there she was waiting at the church, made a dance of it. But it was a mistake to go tactically over the winter, I think.
I get the impression, reading your various books about this period and the diaries, that, I mean, for example, although you had blazing rows with Jim Callaghan, didn't you? I got the impression...
I'm very fond of him.
Yeah, that you all, in different ways, admired him in a way that actually at the time you didn't with Harold Wilson in the same way at the time. I know retrospectively you've all changed a bit.
No, Harold was very generous. He put me in the government when I was 39, and when a few weeks later I indicated to Marcia I was rather lonely, he had me to lunch. I was only the Postmaster General. But at the end he got paranoid, because the trouble is if you live at the North Pole, there's only one direction to go, and that's south. Right. And Harold got so paranoid about Roy and about Jim, and actually it weakened him.
And you, actually, at
I don't know if
times.
he was paranoid about me.
But,
I very much admired Harold. The problem was Harold didn't very much admire me. I mean, it was an unequal relationship. I was Harold's supporter, but he didn't reciprocate my views.
OK, well, look, we're going to take a short break now, and then we're going to look ahead to where you all went following the Wilson-Callaghan period and reflect briefly on how it all compares with now. But let's take a very short break first.